Hey guys, Timothy here. I'm continuing my Battle for Zendikar review. We're going into the blue cards this time. Blue is kind of odd. A lot of the cards we're going to see are basically just reiterations of cards we've seen. Blue doesn't get too creative with what it does, but I don't really know how to evaluate some of the cards yet, but we're going to look at them anyway and just run through them. We're also going to see some of our first devoid cards. White is the only color that doesn't have them, so if you watch the white guide first, we're going to introduce our colorless colored mana cards. One unique note about blue is that some of the cards do things that are typically not very blue, and we'll see those as we go along. But let's go ahead and start off here looking at the commons again. If we can. There we go. So, our very first one, Incubator Drone. This is an Eldrazi drone. It's a 4-mana card with Devoid, and Devoid doesn't play too often into things. There are a couple cards that care about colorless things. Other than that, Devoid has some neat interactions in Constructed, and some very rare interactions in Limited, but Devoid basically just lets you fulfill colorless requirements. This one, when it enters the battlefield, you put a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion onto the battlefield. Eldrazi Scions are upgrades from Eldrazi spawns from the original Zendikar block. The Eldrazi Scions you sack to get 1 mana still, but they're 1/1s instead of 0/1s. Now, Incubator Drone immediately reminds me of Kozilek's Predator. Predator is probably the better card since you get 2 spawns out of it, but it's worth noting you get the same amount of power. You actually get more toughness in this case. So Incubator Drone for 4 mana, you're getting 3/4 spread out around 2 bodies. Kozilek's Predator, you're getting just 3/5, but the Eldrazi don't actually do damage. I think the cards are comparable. Kozilek's Predator is definitely more attrition-y, more value out of one card, but Incubator Drone I think is going to be a very high pick for blue. That extra Eldrazi spawn on top of a decent body is definitely playable in any blue deck, and I think they're going to get grabbed up fairly quickly. Moving on, we get Murkstrider, which immediately reminds me of Separatist Void Mage. For the same mana cost and just a little bit more work, you have to basically unexile a card from your opponent's exile zone and send it back to the graveyard. If you do, when Murkstrider enters the battlefield, you can bounce a creature your opponent controls back to their hand. Void Mage was very good, but it's worth noting that Origins, almost every color was very tempo based. It required you to get ahead by trade in, by sending creatures away, by removal. Basically 1-for-1 in your opponent until you got an advantage. I don't know that that's going to be the case here with Battle for Zendikar, but if so, Murkstrider is going to be just as good as Void Mage, and you even get 1 more power on top of that. So a 3/2 for 4 is already going to be okay. The extra effect should be fairly manageable, especially with some of the blue cards we'll see. So I think this card is going to be a high pick as well, and definitely one to not underestimate. Speaking of enablers, we get to see Mist Intruder here. Now, by itself, this card is pretty bad. I don't like 1/1 flyers for 1, and a 1/2 flyer for 2 I don't think really changes much. The upside to this guy is that he has Ingest. Ingest means whenever that creature deals damage to your opponent, they exile the top card of your library. Now, if you can get Mist Intruder down and start pinging your opponent with it, you're only really dealing 1 damage, so you're not really doing too much to the damage race. The important part is that you're exiling cards, and then you can use effects like Murkstrider with ease. So even though Mist Intruder in a vacuum is not a good looking card, the Ingest and the Evasion, Flying plus Ingest, allows you to enable cards that you'll be using later on. So I think if you're playing blue, I think you definitely want to pick up Mist Intruder. I wouldn't pick up too many of them because, like I said, the card itself doesn't change the format very much. I don't think mill is going to be a huge thing. I can imagine some people trying to mill through Ingest, but I would use this as an enabler rather than a creature on its own. As a 2-drop, I think we could probably do a little better. Very similarly, we get to Benthic Infiltrator here. This is a 3-mana 1/4 with Devoid and Ingest as well, and it can't be blocked. So this is even more evasive than the flyer we just saw. This one is getting through no matter what, unless it dies to a removal spell. And every time it hits, it's only dealing 1 damage, but it reliably exiles those cards. And the cards that had the processors that need cards exiled to reach their potential really rely on cards like Benthic Infiltrator and Mist Intruder. So while these 2 cards I don't think are great, they are good enablers and they fit certain decks, and they often play alongside each other very well. Benthic Infiltrator has the upside of having 4 toughness, which blocks very well and can sometimes trade off, makes it so that little 1/1s and 2/1s aren't getting through to you all the time. But I think you want to be attacking with this in the decks you're playing it in more than blocking. Next we get Salvage Drone. We get a little 1-drop here in blue, which is nice. It's also an ingest creature, so it can start exiling cards for your later processors. And it gets the little upside of when it dies, you get the chance to loot if you want. It is a May ability, so you don't have to. Black, when we get to black, you'll see has a lot of sacrifice outlets, which is very nice. So this guy dies, you get the benefit of the sack outlet, plus you get to make your hand a little bit better if you need to. I think, again, this guy is cuttable. He is decent. I wouldn't take too many of them. But the ingest, if you can drop this on turn 1 and then start hitting on turn 2, the ingest will help you out in the long run. And the extra ability is just tacked on there. Makes this guy actually a pretty decent 1-drop. There seem to be some playable 1-drops in this format, and this definitely looks like one of them to me. Spell Shrivel is a neat card. So it's a counter spell, very similar to Mana Leak. But it counters the spell unless the controller pays 4. Now, 4, you're usually going to get a card out of this. Obviously, you're not going to play it if your opponent can pay 4, unless you're just trying to shut them off and playing other cards, which you do sometimes. But the upside here is if your opponent can't pay the 4, then you very likely got a card that cost more than Spell Shrivel, so you traded up in value. There's also an extra bonus that if the spell is countered, you exile it, which, same as the creatures we've just looked at, fuels your processors later in the game, and you need to reliably be able to get cards into your opponent's exile zone to make your processors very well. So blue already looks like it's going to be the type of deck that's more strategically based. You're going to need to time your cards right, and you're going to need to know when to attack, when to block, how to sequence your cards so that you can get the maximum value out of your late game. But Spell Shrivel, even by itself, even if you're not using the exile part to its best, is still a pretty good counter spell. 4 mana is tough for your opponent to play in the early game, and if they're tapping out late game for very big creatures, you can often get them countered this way. So it's much better than Calculated Dismissal, which we just saw. Not quite as good as Mana Leak, though. Moving on, I guarantee Eldrazi Skyspawner is going to be one of the best commons in this set, at least for blue. I won't say overall, but if we just look at Gearcrafter and Sandstepped Outcast from the last couple sets, they do pretty much the same exact thing. Sure, Sandstepped Outcast has another ability, but we all know it really only has one ability, except in very scarce situations. But getting 2 creatures out of 1 card and having 2 blockers for 3 mana or 2 attackers for 3 mana is fantastic. Now Skyspawner is even better, is an upgrade on these 2 cards, since the 2/1 is the one with flying instead of the 1/1, which means you can start getting in damage while leaving behind a chump blocker, or you just get in for 3 damage instead, or you have 2 bodies to block. It's good early game, it's good late game, it's good at almost any point that these 2 are good, and it does its job even better than these top commons from their own set. Also, the token you can sack to mana, which is even better than the Spirit or the Thopter. So Eldrazi Skyspawner, I absolutely guarantee this is going to be one of the best blue cards. If you're blue, you want these. If you have high drops, you want these because you start getting in damage while also curving higher into your ramping cards. Oracle of Dust is an interesting card. I have no earthly idea what's going on in this art. I have no clue. But it is our first processor. It's a 5-mana 3/5, which is pretty playable. And for 2 mana, you get to put a card your opponent owns from exile into the graveyard. If you do, you loot. You draw a card, then you discard a card. It's a good loot too. You draw first, then you choose what to discard. It is a repeatable effect, since you can pay 2 as many times as you want. It's an instant speed effect, so it has that going for it. If you don't have many other cards, many other processors in your deck that you need to keep cards in exile for, this is a pretty decent common to start filtering through cards in your deck until you get to what you need. If you have other processors in your deck, I would be a little hesitant on overloading on this ability. That way you can keep cards in your opponent's graveyard. Cards in your opponent's exile zone for the more impactful processors. Don't get me wrong, this card is perfectly playable. It's just not as good as some of the cards we're about to see. Titan and Coils is kind of a harken to Pin to the Earth from Journey into Nyx. Both of them enchant a creature for 2 mana, and the enchanted creature gets -6/-0. Pin to the Earth was a total flavor fail because even though the creature is literally pinned to the ground, it could still have flying. In this case, they fixed it. That creature loses flying now. So total flavor win here, even though these both involve the Bident, and Thassa's just using octopuses. I'm sorry, Kiora, not Thassa. Pin to the Earth was pretty good in its own format. There were enchantments synergies that made it a lot stronger than it just looks on the outside. Titan and Coils is going to fill a similar role as basically a pacifism, but the creature can still block. It is worth noting that Titan and Coils in this format is going to have a very similar problem as pacifism in Dragons of Tarkir, in that there are a lot of sacrifice outlets. So if you just slap Titan and Coils on a creature, they now have a good target to just sack off with something like Bone Splinters. There are a lot of sacrifice outlets, so in my opinion, that doesn't make your Titan and Coils worse. It just makes their Bone Splinters better, because they're still losing a guy, and they're going to lose their best guy because you Titan and Coils their best guy. But I don't think that makes Titan and Coils a worse card. It just makes it a little more awkward for you, and a little more advantageous for them. Moving in the right direction, get a card that I'm a little wavery on. I think it's a pretty medium card, and it's very similar to the Windrider Eel from Zendikar. Wavewing Elemental is a 3/4 flyer for 6, which is expensive, but when a land enters, it gets +2/+2. So this doesn't look like a Mahamoti Djinn, but when a land enters the battlefield, a 5/6 flyer is just smacking your opponent around. Same thing we said in the last set for white. In the last review for white, if you can instant speed lands in, and there are some ways to do it, especially in green, this guy becomes much better because you can trigger landfall as a combat trick rather than just sorcery speed lands. I think this card is playable, and same thing I've said about a lot of the other flyers. Do not underestimate a late game flyer, especially one that can hit for 5 in the air. So this guy, I think, is a medium pick. I wouldn't race to grab him unless you're really in need of a high drop for your blue deck, but this card does well what it does well, and I think it's worth picking. Not unplayable at all. And then we follow up with kind of a very unexciting card, Rush of Ice. 1 blue mana, you tap a creature, it doesn't untap during the next untap step, and you can awaken it to make a 3/3 for 5 mana. Now, just by itself, this seems bad. Unless you're completely aggro, blue X aggro, and you're just pushing in tons and tons of damage and you need to lock a blocker down, Rush of Ice doesn't do very much. You lose a card to tap down your opponent's creature for 1 turn, and that's it. If you're awakening it, it still doesn't even seem like that high of a payoff. First off, you're spending 5 mana to make a 3/3, and not removing your opponent's creature, but just enabling it for a couple turns. Either mode seems very bad. Not very bad. It's playable, but it'll be cut from my deck very often. But either mode seems way behind what I want to be doing. If I'm going to play a tap effect, it needs to be either a permanent tap or it needs to tap more than one creature. So Rush of Ice, cards that only tap one creature and that's their sole function, I don't love them. And by that I mean temporary tap. Now here's a card I think people are going to dislike off the bat. Royal Mage's Trick. 4 mana, converge. Creatures your opponents control get -X/-0 until the end of turn. X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast it. Then you draw a card. So same thing for every converge card. There's a ceiling and there's a floor. If you're playing a 2-color deck and you can only reliably cast this on 2 different colors, it seems pretty weak. If you can reliably cast it on 3, I like it quite a bit. And if you can cast it on 4, I think it's very good. It's kind of a middle ground between these 2 recent similar cards, Blind and Spray and Hydrolash. Both of them cantrip. Both of them reduce your opponent's creature's power. Hydrolash could only be used on attacking creatures, so it was useless on your turn. But Royal Mage's Trick, I think, is a good middle ground between them, and I think all 3 of these cards are playable. So I think the Trick is going to be playable if you can get at least -3, -0 out of it. If it didn't draw a card, I wouldn't even consider it. But the fact that it draws a card and replaces itself, I am willing to accept. These cards have an added bonus that nobody ever plays around them. If they haven't seen them in your deck yet, your opponents will very likely not play around them. So you can use that to your advantage and blow them out. I've had lots of success with Hydrolash and Origins because nobody suspects the card coming. I imagine it's going to be very similar with Royal Mage's Trick. Coral Helm Guide is a 2 mana, 2/1, 5 mana, target creature can't be blocked this turn. There are very good targets to make unblockable, and at the very least this is still a 2/1 for 2. So it passes the bear test. It has a relevant late game ability, and it is an ally. Blue has a couple allies here, not as many as white, and not nearly as many impactful ones as white. But if you are playing allies and converge or something along those lines, this might be a good one to pick up. Also, if you're in blue and you just need to fill that 2-drop, 2 slot, you get this guy, and you have a relevant late game ability. Dispel. People are very happy to see this back, mostly for standard though. Dispel in draft is more of a sideboard card that you could play main board, but sometimes it's a dead card. Also, you could play it in sealed main deck and have a better chance of hitting something a little more potent with it. But I think Dispel should stay in the sideboard until you've seen a really good target for it. Putting Dispel in your deck main board just in case your opponent has a combat trick is not a bad idea. Not at all. I think Negate is a main deckable card in draft, and Dispel is for the same reasons. But Dispel is not nearly as versatile as Negate, and it's often more of a dead card than Negate will ever be. Your opponent may just never have an instant in their hand, or they may never cast it, and then your Dispel does nothing. Clutch of Currents, another 1-drop blue card with Awaken that I'm equally unexcited about. This one returns a creature to its owner's hand, but does it at sorcery speed, so it's unsummon with the upside of being able to Awaken. Now this isn't bad. If you are playing a tempo-based game and you need to push in damage or you're just racing your opponent, this can do the trick. It can also just sway the game in your favor with Awaken. The 3/3 is not huge, but bouncing your opponent's creature while at the same time adding to your board is not too unsimilar from just the second card we saw here, the 3/2 that bounces a creature. So for Awaken 5, this may actually be a card, but if you don't plan on using the Awaken or you're just using this very early game to slow your opponent down, I would pick up a different card over this. Again, same as the 1 mana tap your opponent's creature for a turn. I think this is playable but cuttable. Cloud Manta, we get a playable flyer here. 3/2s for 3 are good on the ground. 3/2s for 4 are good flyers. It's a little bit weird, but I would be happy playing this in the blue deck. Blue likes to get in damage, and while it's not as good as some of the Sirens we saw with the same power and toughness to converted mana cost in the Theros block, it's a perfectly serviceable attacker in blue, and it can get there in the air while you're mucking up the ground. Brilliant Spectrum, I am passing off as kind of a bad card. Converge, draw X cards, X is the number of colors you spent on this. Then discard 2 cards. I thought this was amazing, and then there were these 4 words at the end, then discard 2 cards. So if you're casting this for 4, it's basically divination. You're adding 2 cards to your hand. You do get a little bit of selection, but it's not really that great. If you're casting it for 3, you're really only adding 1 card to your hand, and you really net the same number of cards because you had to cast Brilliant Spectrum. This is only, I think, really playable on 4 different colors. Anything less than 3, I think it's completely unplayable. I would look to not pick this card up very often at all, unless I have some sort of graveyard shenanigans. But there isn't too much of that, and honestly, I'm happy passing this draw spell. We get to play with Anticipate again. Anticipate is very good. Well, I won't say very good. It is solid in limited, especially if you're playing multiple colors. If you're heavy in blue, you can reliably use Anticipate to help find your next color or find your splash color. That, or sometimes you can just use it to improve your draws, make your hand better, find an answer if you need to. I just noticed it looks like Majora's Mask is on the end of this thing. But anyway, Anticipate is a fine pickup. It's not something you need 4 or 5 different copies of if they keep coming around, but 1 or 2 copies is pretty good in any blue deck, I think. Horribly Awry, moving into the uncommon. So this is a Devoid Instant. It's a 2-mana counter spell that counters converted mana cost 4 or less. I'm sorry, it counters a target creature spell, only creature spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. So it's going to be better in the early game. It won't counter your opponent's big Eldrazi's. It does have the same upside as our last counter spell. If the spell is countered, it's exiled, which helps our processors out. This is very good at a late game or early game. Using a 2-mana counter spell to counter even a 2, 3, or 4 drop is pretty good. And like we said, enabling our big guys later on seems like a very good bet. Speaking of which, we get to look at one of our processors here. We have Allmods Reclaimer. Basically the same exact effect as Mnemonic Wall, but you have to return a card from exile in your opponent's exile zone to their graveyard to get the ability, which by the time you get to 5 mana to cast this, shouldn't be too hard. The added bonus is if you're playing cards like Horribly Awry and you get to exile something, you get to then use Allmods Reclaimer, returning the exiled card to your opponent's graveyard, and then get back the card you used to exile it. So you can use your counter spells to exile, you can use your ingest creatures to exile. It should not be that hard to get your opponent's cards into exile so you can use this effect. And then, if you are using this effect, this guy becomes very good. Mnemonic Wall is already a playable card, but it has the downside of being just a big defender that's never going to do any damage once you get that spell back. This guy actually has a bigger toughness plus the ability to trade off with things, kill things that are attacking into it, and attack itself. It does not have defender. So I think this card's pretty good. I would be happy having at least one of them in any of my blue decks, and if I have very good spells to get back, I would be very happy having more of them. We get Tiedrifter here, 2-mana devoid creature. Our other colorless creatures get +0/+1. So this is kind of what I meant when I said blue has things going on that don't seem very blue. A pump spell or a pump creature, a ward for our colorless creatures is kind of odd. This one itself is just an 0-5, so it's never really doing very much damage, if any. It needs other cards to get in damage, but it blocks very well. It comes down on turn 2, and it makes our other colorless creatures pretty good. So even though we're spending colored mana on maybe our 1 or 2 drops, they are still colorless creatures if they have Devoid, and they get this guy's toughness boost. We get kind of the opposite of that here. For 3 mana, we get a 3/2 that gives our other colorless creatures +1/+0. So they get a power boost instead. This one has ingest, so it can set up our enablers. But these two together make for kind of the lords of the colorless creatures, and using their effects simultaneously basically gives an anthem to all of our colorless guys. That includes Eldrazi Scions, so any Eldrazi Scions that come in are 2/1s instead of 1/1s, which is a pretty big deal off of creatures you're basically getting for free. Cryptic Cruiser, a card that I think has a lot of potential, won't always be great, but can definitely swing a game in your favor. Now, we're looking at a 4-drop for a 3/3, so it's already playable as a Hill Giant. For 3 mana and processing a card, you tap a creature. Now, that's very good. If you're attacking consistently, or you need to use this defensively, you can use this pretty reliably with our enablers. So if Mist Intruder is getting in for damage every turn, even if it's only doing 1 damage, you're exiling 1 card per turn. Then for 3 mana, once per turn, you can tap one of your opponent's creatures. You can tap down a blocker so you can keep getting in. You can tap down an attacker on their turn. You can use this very flexibly. And Cryptic Cruiser doesn't tap for this ability, so if you're managing to exile multiple cards from your opponent every turn, you can use this multiple times. I think this card is very good. It is an uncommon, and I would be happy having it. I think if I took it early, I would look to have Benthic, Infiltrator, and Mist Intruder in my deck. Adverse conditions. It seems like we always get this sort of effect in nearly every set. 4 mana instant. Tap up to 2 target creatures. They don't untap during their controller's next untap step. Put a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion onto the battlefield. So Sudden Storm is essentially the same thing, except you scry instead of getting the Scion. It seems like a fair trade. Scry on this ability was good, and Sudden Storm was a very good common. And getting a 1/1 Scion is just as good in my opinion. You're getting value out of it either way. Will of the Naga usually costs somewhere around 2 to 4 mana and had the same effect. It's very tempo based. Hopefully if you're casting it, you're doing something while your opponent's creatures are tapped down. You can use it defensively as well. A lot of times Send to Sleep in Magic Origins was used as a defensive spell or a stall tactic. You can use it this way, but it pairs well if you're attacking while their opponent's creatures are tapped down. Getting the 1/1 out of this just pushes it for me, and I think that justifies the uncommon over the common. I think the card's good. I think it's good in multiples, and I'd be happy to pick up at least 2 or 3 of them in a draft. Coastal Discovery, less exciting for me. So on its base, it's a 4 mana divination. Draw 2 cards for 4 mana. For 6 mana, it's draw 2 cards plus make a 4/4. Now, my initial reaction is I don't like this card very much. But if I imagine a creature instead that says it's a 4/4 for 6, when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards, I would play that for 6 mana. It's not amazing, but it definitely gets you value and a pretty good blocker. Pretty good body on the field. I'm going to evaluate this card kind of the same way. Sure, it turns one of your lands into a creature, so it's not like you're up too much. That creature can die and you lose your land. But if you think about it as a 4/4 creature that draws you 2 cards, I think it's actually pretty good. This is one of those cards where the Awaken is what I want to be casting it for, but it's kind of a little bit strange that if I'm mana screwed, I really kind of need to cast it at 4. I want to cast this card at 6. I don't want to cast it at 4, but sometimes I have to. I think I would be fine playing one of these in a deck. I don't think I would want to overload on them, though. Windrider Patrol, 5 mana, Merfolk Wizard. This is a flyer. It doesn't look like it, but it is a flyer. And whenever he deals combat damage, you scry 2. The body is very nice on this for a flyer. So 5 mana, 4/3 flyer is pretty good. Being able to scry 2 whenever it deals damage, just added bonus for me. This card strikes me as very good. Strikes me as not just a role filler, but a finisher if you need it to be that. And scry 2 just kind of makes your draws better while it's going. It does pair up pretty poorly against some of the other flyers we've already seen in white. The 3 toughness seems to be where the flyers are at, or 3 to 4 toughness. So when we get big flyers in the air, I think there's going to be a lot of battle to see whose flyer is winning the race. But the scry 2 on this one, I think, makes it better than most of the other flyers we've seen so far. Now here's one I'm excited about. Halmar Tidecaller, or Narset of the Waves, as I'm going to call her. 3 mana for a 2/3 is good. It is an ally too, which is kind of random, but pretty decent. When it enters the battlefield, you can return a target card with Awaken from your graveyard to your hand. And then your land creatures have flying. This card excites me a lot. There are a lot of good Awaken cards. Even if you're not using the Awaken on them, you can still get the card back with this guy's ability. I'm sorry, this girl's ability. I'm sorry, this lady's ability. I'm thinking the 5 mana board wipe in white or Ruinous Path. Anything that kills a creature, I can then Halmar Tidecaller that card back and kill another creature. And then we get an added bonus of anything that we've awoken or any man lands we have, suddenly they have flying and can just attack in the air. I put Clutch of Currents here because it actually gives you a unique combo where you can play Clutch of Currents, bounce a creature your opponent controls, and then make a 3/3, and then follow up with Tidecaller, return Clutch of Currents to your hand, and then repeatedly keep casting Clutch of Currents on Tidecaller, making more 3/3s, and then using the Tidecaller to get this back. That's more of a cute combo. There are definitely better things you could be doing, but in a long game, making a bunch of 3/3 flyers over and over again is pretty insane. Also, some of the Awakened creatures are a lot stronger than that, and this guy can definitely push us over the top. This lady. I think this card is super valuable. I think it's going to be a very high pick, and I think it's somewhat of a draft around or a build around card. I would be looking to do some very unique combos with the Tidecaller. And then we're following that up with a card that I'm kind of having a little bit of trouble evaluating. The Deafening Pulse has a relevant ability. It's an enchantment for 4 mana. Your opponent's creatures basically get weaker. So their Eldrazi Scions are basically Eldrazi spawn again, and all of their other creatures get -1/-0. Some of the bigger creatures in this format don't care about -1/-0, and that's why I'm not too excited about this, because really, if your opponent's playing something like a 7/7, then making it a 6/7 is not that much different. I would rather have something that actually deals with that creature completely than just makes it a little bit weaker. I think this is the type of card that people are going to try to draft often and draft in multiples, and sometimes it'll work well. Sometimes it'll just be kind of slowing down the pace, which can be fine. It makes combat easier for you, as your opponent being weaker makes your blocks better and your attacks better, but I don't think it's a card that I want. In multiples, I also don't think I really want it, but I admit there could be a deck that just grabs these and makes it a lot better. This is something that's worth noting in Two-Headed Giant as well. Just the type of effect that can adversely affect both opponents or benefit both partners are worth taking or worth having in your sealed pool. So if you're playing Two-Headed Giant, this card might be the real deal for you. And if you get it in multiples, it could be quite good. Alright, the blue Retreat to Coral Helm. 3 mana this time instead of the 4 mana white one. When a land enters, landfall trigger either lets us tap or untap a creature, or we get to scry 1. Both of these abilities are great. The consistent tapping and untapping just lets us push in damage if we need to. It's not as useful on our opponent's turn since there aren't too many ways to instant speed our lands in, but it is possible. I'm a little more excited for the Scry 1. It turns all of our lands into Scry lands, and this, as we've played with Scry lands for the past year, Scry lands are good. I'm sorry, the past 2 years. Scry lands are good. They make your draws better. They let you see what's coming up, and scrying off of every land you play is no joke. It will favor you in the long run if you scry off of every land you play. I think Retreat to Coral Helm will be a good addition to any blue deck. If you have to use the tap or untap ability, or if that's your plan, it's very good, but having just the Scry 1 without the tap would be fine by itself. And we move on to the rares now. Drowner of Hope is the Eldrazi rare for blue. It is a 5/5 for 6, which is a pretty big body. That is not negligible at all. When it enters the battlefield, you automatically get 2/1/1 Eldrazi Scion, so you're getting 7/7 for 6 mana. It already passed the test of being powerful in that regard. It gets an added ability, sacrifice an Eldrazi Scion, tap a creature. So you have 2 taps automatically plus any additional taps on any other Scions, and you're probably pushing in damage with this guy. 5 a turn is not something you can race very easily, not something you can keep up with quite well. This guy can be used defensively, can be used on offense, and I think it's just great. I think this is a first pickable rare. It's a little more exciting than some of the other rares we're about to see, and I think it is fantastic. Speaking of not so fantastic, let's look at Exert Influence. Now, I'm not going to completely write this card off, but let's read it first. 5 mana, converge, gain control of target creature if its power is less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast Exert Influence. So, the pros here, if you take control of the opponent's creature, this is a sorcery, so it's a permanent effect. They don't get it back at the end of turn. They don't get to target an enchantment and destroy the enchantment and get it back. You just get to keep that creature. The cons, quite a few. It's better in decks that can support higher mana costs. It can't take anything that's more than 5 mana, converted mana. So if your opponent plays a huge 6/6, and there is a creature that can be a 9/9 for 6 mana, this card does nothing about it, and that's pretty poor. I think this is one of the worst rares in the set. It can be useful, but it most of the time will be quite poor. Also, it's best in 5-color decks, and I don't really think this is what you want to be doing in a 5-color deck, is taking control of an opponent's creature. I will not write it off, though. It can be powerful in certain matchups, but sometimes it just doesn't work when you need it to work. Follow that up with what I think is actually even a worse one. Prism Array is another 5 mana converge spell. Enters with a crystal counter for each color of mana spent to cast it. So if you spend 5 different colors, it gets 5 crystal counters. If you spend blue and 4 green, it gets 2 crystal counters. 2 other abilities. You remove a counter from it, tap a creature. So maximum you can tap up to 5 times. If you paid all 5 different colors, you get 5 taps on it. That's not completely negligible, but it's not really great because it runs out. And then for 1 of each color, you can scry 3. I'm not sure if I was playing 5 colors and I had access to all of it, that's really what I want to be doing with my colors. I want to be playing bigger spells. Some of the other converge spells are much, much better if you're paying all 5 colors for them. Scry 3 is not completely something you should write off, but spending that much mana to do it is not really great. This card does different things, but it doesn't do them very well or in a way that's very synergistic. This is a stall card if ever I've seen one, and it's not a very good one. I would pass this pretty much any time I saw it. Even if I could support 5 colors, I think I would still be fine passing this over a better converged creature. Ugin's Insight is a good draw spell in my opinion. 5 mana, Scry X. X is the highest converted mana cost among permanents you control, then draw 3 cards. Some of the cards in this set have very high converted mana costs. If you're playing this on curve, you've probably got a 4-drop, which means you can Googins Insight, Scry 4, and then draw 3 cards. That is very good. Sure, it's not dig through time. It's not Jace's Ingenuity. Jace's Ingenuity may or may not be better. This is sorcery speed. Jace's Ingenuity was instant, and that does make a difference. But imagine having something like a 6 or 7 drop and being able to look at 7 cards, throw the ones you don't want away, and then draw 3 cards. The card selection is very strong. Now, there is a little bit of a downside here. It means sorcery speed. Means that if you cast it and then your opponent bumps off your high converted mana cost card and you have something like a 1-drop or a 2-drop left as your highest card, then you don't get to scry as much. At the very least, though, if you have nothing on the board at all, you can pay 5 mana to draw 3 cards, and that's a fine ability by itself. So this passes the test in almost every regard. I would be fine playing this in any blue deck that can support it. And we get our cancel of the format. This time it's a rare. 3 mana, counter target spell. So there's the cancel part of it. Alternatively, 6 mana, counter spell, and awaken 3. I think this card is fine in either mode. 6 mana to bump off a strong spell from your opponent and make it 3/3 is good. And 3 mana to counter spell is always playable. It's not always the most exciting thing. It's not as good as Dissolve or Dissipate or anything like that. But cancel is always playable, if not exciting. So I think this is a fine pickup for any blue deck. But I wouldn't push it too hard to try and get awaken out of it. If you can counter a good if you can counter a good spell on turns 4 or 5, I wouldn't wait too long to try and get the 6 mana for it. Alright, now here's a good card. A card I would be very happy to open. Guardian of Tazim. 5 mana for a 4/5 flyer. That by itself is fantastic. That is what you want out of a 5 mana flyer. Is a big butt so that it doesn't die to the other flyers, plus a very strong attack. Now landfall. And this is a cycle of cards, a cycle that cares about what type of land you put into play with its landfall trigger, in this case island, obviously. Landfall, if a land enters battlefield under your control, you tap a creature an opponent controls. If the island triggered landfall, that creature doesn't untap during their next untap step. So this card doesn't even need landfall to be good. It doesn't even need islands to be good. Just playing a land and tapping an opponent's creature lets you get in probably with this and something else, or tap down your opposing flyer, get in for 4 damage in the air. Huge upside if you play an island. You get to tap something down and then just ignore it for a turn because it won't untap. If you have to just use this with something other than an island, it's great. If you're using it with an island, it's fantastic. I am always first picking this card if I see it in a pack. It can probably just win you the game in the long run, and it deals very well with the other flyers that we've seen so far. Finally, we get our blue mythic. It's a little disappointing, but I think it's getting a little bit of negativity as well. I don't know how playable it is in Limited. Let's look at it real quick. Part the Water Veil is a 6 mana blue spell. Take an extra turn, exile part the Water Veil. Awaken 6 for 9 mana, triple blue. You're taking an extra turn and making a 6/6. Now, upside and downside. 6 mana just to take an extra turn is not going to be that great unless you're very far ahead and you're pushing in lots of damage. If you're behind and you draw apart the Water Veil, basically all this does is get you draw a card. 6 mana, draw an extra card, try again. And that's not very exciting. Taking extra turns is what you want to be doing when you're very far ahead and you're very close to winning. Now at 9 mana, this is a real spell. At 9 mana, making a 6/6, that can probably attack that turn. Maybe not if you just played your 9th land. But making a 9/9 I'm sorry, making a 6/6 and then getting an extra turn is a pretty real deal. But you have to be realistic. Sorry for the noises again. You have to be realistic. 9 mana is a lot, and a lot of games end before you get to 9 mana. Now, the reason I think this is doable is because we've seen a lot of cards that make Eldrazi Scions, so you can ramp yourself up to 9, make a 6/6, and then attack on the following turn, plus get an extra turn. I think you can probably cast this for around 6 mana and some Eldrazi Scions in blue, so I don't think you can completely write this card off. I think it's better than Temporal Trespass, even though I never actually tried to play Temporal Trespass. I'm not going to write this off. One extra note about this is that the card exiles itself, so if your opponent's playing Processors, it kind of helps them out a little bit, but I don't think it matters too much. I don't think the exile clause is going to be super relevant. If I open this card, I would try to play it if I was heavy blue. If I was just splashing blue, or I was very light on blue, like 7 lands or something, I would probably just leave it out altogether. But I don't think you can completely write this card off. I would be happy having it, but I admit that it's not as exciting as an extra turn card can be. And that's all we get for blue. I don't think blue is as strong as the white cards we've seen. White is definitely more aggressive, and some of blue's tempo cards are a little weak, but blue also has a lot of really good tricks, and the Eldrazi cards are very synergistic and very good, especially the Processors that we've seen. Blue has some good rares, and it has some of the worst rares in the set, so if you're playing blue, good luck, but it's going to be a little bit of back and forth. So there you go with blue. I will be back for the next color shortly. Again, leave comments below. Let me know what you think about some of these cards, where I'm about a week from pre-release, and I do appreciate other people's opinions. So if you think I'm over-evaluating or under-evaluating, or if you found some cool combo with one of these cards that I didn't point out,